Hi folks. This week I sat down with Peter Taylor. For those of you who don't know, Peter is a British journalist and documentary maker. Much of his adult life has been spent covering the period known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He's made documentaries for ITV and the BBC and has written multiple books about the Troubles. I'd say many episodes I've released have used documentaries from Peter as a source. His latest book is called Operation Chiffon, the secret story of MI5 and MI6 and the road to peace in Ireland, and focuses on the secret back channels that were taking place between the British government and the IRA, and the extraordinary people who made that happen. It's hard to really describe the importance of Peter Taylor's role throughout the Troubles. He is a man who has gained the trust of virtually every side of this conflict, and broadcast their experiences to the people of the world. He met with Republicans and Loyalists alike, who trusted him to tell their story without bias. And I'd argue that Peter is one of the most influential journalists to have operated during this period. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's get into the interview. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. I began things by asking Peter why he decided to focus on Northern Ireland when he was starting out as a journalist.
I had only a sort of working interest in Northern Ireland as a young journalist back in the early 1970s. And I knew from reading that there was going to be trouble in Derry, London Derry, at the end of January 1972 with the big planned civil rights march. And there had been problems with, there'd been a confrontation between the army, the paras, and the civil rights marchers the previous Sunday, the Gilligan Strand, when they were protesting against internment. Because when we say there were civil rights marchers, they were, but the particular focus of their protest was internment without trial. So given what had happened the previous Sunday at the Gilligan Strand, when the protesters were corralled and given a hard time by the army, it was clear that the big march planned for the following Sunday was going to be troublesome. And cut a long story short, I tried to get 3 crews. I was then working for Thames Television, ITV's This Week program, tried to get 3 crews to cover the march, 1 crew with the marchers, 1 crew with the army, and 1 crew given free range. However, that didn't happen. I went to Derry. I got to Derry after the shootings. I got late in the evening of the Sunday evening. And I was horrified at what I was told, what I was told by bystanders and people who were on the march that day. And I couldn't believe that my soldiers, because the paras were British regiment, were responsible for the alleged shootings, killings, murders referred to by the marchers. And I felt guilty about that, if indeed it was true. I also felt guilty that, this is the point, as a young journalist, knowing very little about Northern Ireland at the time, not actually knowing where London Derry was specifically, didn't understand why it had 2 names, Derry and Londonderry. So it was the beginning of a 50-plus year journey trying to make sense of the Troubles. And that's how it all began. It began because I felt guilty at knowing so little about Northern Ireland. And as a young journalist, I made up my mind that I had to find out. And that's what I spent 50-odd years trying to do. And I became hooked on the issue, hooked on the problem, in the process of trying to understand what it was all about, what its historical origins were. And I remember that summer in 1972, going on holiday with my wife, with a bag full of books on Irish history, which I then started devouring in the sunshine on a Greek island.
We then started talking about Bloody Sunday, which saw 13 unarmed civilians shot dead by the Parachute Regiment of the British Army on January 30th, 1972, and is generally regarded as one of the most significant events of the Troubles.
Well, the first thing I had to do was find somewhere to stay. All the hotels were booked, so I stayed at a boarding house. I remember going to bed late on the Sunday evening of the killings, and being nervous that I might be targeted by an IRA sniper through the bedroom window. I mean, it's ludicrous to think about it, but such was the climate of the time. The following morning, I went down into the bogside, and I remember vividly there was nobody around. You could almost touch the silence in the air. There were flowers on the ground where those who had been killed had fallen. No pools of blood by the flowers. And I went round and started knocking on doors very nervously to talk to people who'd been there. These are people who were eyewitnesses in the bogside, and listen to their story. And I was nervous about being, shown the door, having it slammed in my face, me being a British journalist. But on the contrary, people invited me in, gave me tea, Blue Ribbon biscuits, I remember being given. They were just grateful that a British journalist had taken the trouble to come and ask them about what they had seen, what had happened. And then I remember interviewing the then commander of the Derry Brigade of the IRA, who told me that the IRA had removed its arms from the bogside, and that the army had opened fire on them rather than the Provisional IRA opening fire on the army. And in the long term, that turned out to be true. And I've interviewed Lord Savile in great detail about his report. And he has no doubt, apart from a couple of initial shots that were fired by the official IRA at the Paras in a different part of the bogside, is that the army, the Paras, opened up first, did the dreadful things that they did. And then I made a film called Two Sides of a Story, in which I did an interview with an eyewitness in the bogside overlooking the barricade where 3 young men were shot dead by the Paras. And he happened to be a former British soldier who had moved to Derry, lived in Derry. He was part of a Welsh regiment, and he described in vivid detail, awful detail, what he had seen. So that's what I did. We did a film called Two Sides of a Story, in which my interview with Jack Chapman was the name of the British soldier, and my colleague Peter Williams from This Week interviewed the Paras, full face. So it was two sides of a story. The only way we could get it on the air was by doing it like that. I interviewed Jack Chapman for his account on the balcony overlooking the barricade where 3 shot dead. So it was absolutely balanced. There was no editing of the film. It was warts and all, clapperboards, fluffs. There were 2 independent accounts diversity of what had happened. So that was my introduction, and that's how it started.
I then asked Peter, did he face any resistance or hostility from locals as he knocked on doors and asked questions about what happened on the day?
Well, I thought there might be a backlash, as you say, because of my accent, because I was a British journalist, not working for the BBC then, but working for ITV, and I'd never been to Ireland before, didn't know where Derry was. So I went into the bogside and started knocking on doors with a degree of trepidation. And I was surprised and gratified to find that far from having the door slammed in my face, people were happy to talk to me, to give their account of what they had seen, what they had seen with their own eyes whilst being on the march, and recounting it to me. And they were, pleased that I was taking the trouble to try and find out. So there was surprisingly, to me at the time, there was no hostility to me as being a Brit and a British journalist in, quotes, enemy territory, talking to people who've been on the march, and also talking to the IRA commander.
But how did that happen then? Would you continue knocking and say, hey, do you know where the commander is? Can I speak to him?
Look, I just asked around, saying I would like to talk to somebody from the IRA, and I was directed to the old gasworks at the far end of the bogside, where I met the then commander of the Provisional IRA at the time. Martin McGuinness was second in command. Martin McGuinness took over as OC shortly after Bloody Sunday. But I remember meeting the commander and listening to what he said about there were no arms in the bogside, which tarried ultimately with what Lord Cecil. Yeah. So interviewing the commander of the IRA, who was in charge on Bloody Sunday, and hearing his account was fascinating, was slightly intimidating, because I'd never dealt with the IRA before. I had preconceptions of the IRA, which were either confirmed or dismissed. So that was my introduction, and it was, yes, I was hesitant and nervous as a green, young, pretty ignorant journalist about Ireland, but that's how I started my involvement, to try and find out and understand, and also not just for me to understand, but for me to convey my understanding for what it was worth to a television audience, and subsequently people who read my books.
Well, in a way, I guess you were the conduit. They knew by speaking to you, you were going to broadcast their side of the story, or what is happening on, from their perspective, I guess.
And the other thing is the people trusted me to do it. That's what I always found in the years ahead, that I could only do what I did then and what I subsequently did over the following years, because people trusted me and I trusted them. It was that mutual trust and confidence on both sides, whoever was on the other side, that enabled me to do what I did. And the first test was on Bloody Sunday. And subsequently, as you may know, I interviewed many of the paras who took part, who were obviously, they had their view of what happened, but the fact that they were prepared to talk to me indicated the way in which I knew I had to carry on covering Ireland. I had to reflect the views, however diametrically opposed they were, of different parties involved in the conflict, and that's what I continued to try to do.
I asked Peter how he went about earning the trust of paramilitaries, as it was not an easy thing to do during such a terse period.
There was a simple test, which I tended to apply, throughout my career reporting on Ireland and other conflicts too. People I interviewed, people I filmed, would watch, in most cases, the result on their television screen. And they could judge whether I had done what I said I was trying to do, which is to give a fair account of what they told me. So the test was always there. And the trust emerged over a period of time from that ongoing test. And I would say to people, be they, Republicans, IRA, Loyalists, UDA, UVF, or whatever, when I did the big series and wrote the books, Provos and Loyalist of Brits, I would say to, in particular, the paramilitaries on both sides, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give a fair account of what the view is from your particular vantage point, from your side. And you can judge whether I do it or not when you watch the programs. So as often as not, I would then go back to Ireland after particular programs and talk to those that I'd interviewed and said, what did you think? Did I do what I said I would do? And by and large, in many cases, rather grudgingly, they said, well, for a Brit, it wasn't bad. That would be from the Republican side.
The height of praise.
I'm not bad for a Brit. And I still get And I got that reaction too from certain quarters, certain Republican quarters, after the publication of my books, Provos, Loyalists to Brits, and latterly Operation Chiffon. So that was gratifying. It was sort of grudging acceptance, grudging praise. I wouldn't call it praise, but grudging acceptance that what I did is what I said I would do.
Gaining the trust of paramilitaries was one thing, but as Peter was reporting for British television, I asked him if his coverage ever upset the British government.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I mean, my coverage was not trouble-free. In the late 1970s, when I grew increasingly concerned about the allegations that IRA suspects and some Loyalist suspects too were being ill-treated during interrogation in Castlereagh, to try and get them to give admissions, confessions signed that could then be used in a court of law. And I was a bit skeptical about the allegation, because the immediate reaction is, IRA propaganda. Well, of course they would say that, wouldn't they? But talking to doctors who were examining suspects before and after interrogation, I increasingly had no doubt that suspects were being ill-treated. I then made a film inside the Maze prison, not made a film inside the Maze prison, but got hold of filming inside the Maze prison came sort of 10, 20 years later. But I got hold of little cassettes of film that the paramilitaries had filmed, the Loyalists had filmed inside the Maze, which was jerky, sort of silent movie type, to show what life was like inside the Maze. And then I was criticised by Roy Mason, who was the then Northern Ireland Secretary, who said that my coverage was, quote, unhelpful to the government. To which my response was, well, my job isn't to be helpful to the government, helpful to any side. My job is to try and reflect, as we've discussed, what those various parties' view of the situation was. So I ran into problems there. And I remember when I made the Maze documentary, Enemies Within, which is perhaps the most remarkable film I've ever made, because I was given complete unfettered access to Loyalist and Republican IRA prisoners inside the Maze with no minders, nothing at all. The only agreement was that we agreed, this was when I was with the BBC in the late 1989, I think it was. We agreed to show them, the prison authorities, the film, not because they could censor it or change anything, but just to make sure that there was nothing that we had inadvertently filmed that risked security.
Yeah,
so,
security risks. Yeah, that makes sense.
Was hard. Yeah. So, yes, I did have my problems with the authorities, with various governments, and as did many of my colleagues. When I was making the Maze documentary, which was at the time the height of the broadcasting restrictions, in which, as you will recall, broadcasters could not broadcast the actual sound of people who were members of paramilitary or connected with paramilitary organizations. And of course, filming inside the Maze, interviewing endless Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries, that caused, shall we say, a minor problem. And
so you had to dub the voices, did you?
Yeah. Well, no, we didn't. We only did because the legislation said that if the individuals were connected, speaking on behalf of their paramilitary organization, that's where we had to subtitle. So although there were endless interviews, fascinating interviews with Loyalist and Republican prisoners inside the Maze, it was only when I interviewed anybody who was speaking on behalf of the IRA in this particular case, that we had to use subtitles. And that was when I filmed a sequence with the IRA's food spokesman meeting the prison food officer, that we had to subtitle the IRA food spokesman's words, which were, "The sausage rolls, they're not big enough."
I think
of the whole thing.
in Operation Chiffon, you describe Northern Ireland as a semantic minefield. And even down to the likes of this, it's such a nuance in how you have to use the
Well, in that case, it was tiptoeing very gingerly and very carefully through the minefield of the broadcasting restrictions.
In one case, Peter and his camera crew were attacked by Loyalists.
We were filming in a Loyalist enclave at the bottom of Lenadune Avenue as Catholics who had been intimidated by Loyalists out of their areas, in mixed areas, were seeking refuge and houses vacated by Loyalists at the bottom end of Lenadune Avenue. And Loyalists didn't like the fact, to put it mildly, that the media was reflecting what was happening, and the fact that Loyalists were having to move out of the bottom end of Lenadune Avenue. So they didn't like us filming, and they attacked us, and it was fairly hairy. It wasn't that serious, but it was very well. There's a famous photograph of my film unit and I being attacked by Loyalists. So they took the camera and they took the film, and we subsequently got the camera back by the auspices of a friendly Protestant local priest from the Protestant area. So it was only it was an indication of how sensitive these issues were. And in that case, I think the IRA orchestrated the ending of the ceasefire that the hard men didn't really want anyway. But and it also showed the Loyalist visceral opposition, to Republicans and nationalists who are invading, as they saw it, their area, but also to journalists who had the temerity to try and report on what was happening. So that was that was an indication as well. Yeah.
I bring up PR a lot in this podcast, so I asked Peter how both paramilitary groups viewed media and PR.
The IRA always knew that the media was a vehicle on which or through which they could get their message across. In my case, I think they understood that I wasn't a mouthpiece for them or any paramilitary organization, but I was prepared to listen to and analyze, and where necessary, be critical of what their position was. They accepted that, and the IRA or Republicans, Sinn Féin, use the media to their advantage, and the media, by and large, was prepared to take on board what they were saying. So they were streets ahead. They were light years ahead in their sophisticated use of the media to convey their message. And I was always conscious that I might be used, or the BBC or ITV might be used as a propaganda vehicle for the IRA. So that's something that one was always had to be aware of. Interestingly, in contrast, Loyalists and Unionists were light years behind in the recognition that the media was a potential vehicle to get their message across. They always complained that their message was not received. Well, that, in my view, was their fault. And again, a lesson was, after I made the I think it was 5 1-hours called Provos, the trilogy Provos, Loyalists and Brits. After we did Provos, which was just a one-off, I then went to talk to Loyalists And I'd suggested to my senior colleagues at the BBC that we'd done Provos, which went down, which made its mark. It was a landmark series, 5 1 hours on the BBC. And I think it was on BBC One. I went to my bosses and said, look, that's simply one side of the story. We really ought to try and do the same thing by looking at the Loyalists. So Provos, we should do Loyalists. And I think they said, would the Loyalists agree? And I said, well, I think they might, but the only way to find out is to go over there and do it. And in those days, I had the freedom and the resources to go over to Northern Ireland, to spend time on the ground talking to people, which is much more difficult nowadays because of cost, I'm afraid. So I was very privileged in having the backing and the resources to do what I had to do the job that I was trying to do, and to do it properly. So I went to Belfast with some colleagues. So I went over to Belfast for the BBC with my producer Sam Collins, with whom I made many of my best films. And we had a meeting with actually it was with the UVF, and they'd seen the Loyalist had been, when Provos was transmitted, it was required viewing all over Northern Ireland, certainly in Belfast. And there were signs outside pubs, not saying, Man United v Liverpool tonight on Sky. It said, tonight, Provos, episode whatever, come and watch. I mean, that was amazing. It was
in a pub. That's fascinating, yeah.
But not just in nationalist and Republican areas, but in Loyalist areas too.
Well, so, know thy enemy, I guess I'd imagine this would be...
Yeah, exactly. So I was surprised when I talked to the UVF, the leadership and their senior people. And I remember meeting UVF former prisoners who'd been released from the maze, wearing UVF uniform, black leather jackets, not masked. And I said to them, look, you've seen Provos. We would like to make a sort of balancing series about your side, about loyalism and unionism, about your side of the story. And I went round the table. I said, I'm going to go round and just ask you, who you are, how long you've been in the UBF, what you did, why you did what you did. And if I do that and want to interview you, you would have to be prepared to take some tough questions, which you would expect me to ask, but also to do it full face to camera, as happened in Provo. And they agreed, and we went off to Beatty's fish and chip shop in the Shankill Road afterwards, with 2 or 3 of them, and carried on the conversation over fish and chips and salt and vinegar, and lots of tea. And they were completely open about killing people, murdering people, why they did it, how they felt about it. And so we did Loyalists, which in a way was an even greater eye-opening series than...
almost a more murky, lesser-known world in a way.
They basically, answering your original question, they got Loyalists got the message that that they could use the media, although they recognized that it was going to be filtered by people like me and my colleagues who had a job to do. They saw the opportunity to get their message across by using the media, by not being hostile to the media, because in particular, Loyalist and Unionist had an ongoing and abiding hostility to the media because they thought they got a raw deal for that
rap. Yeah,
and to a certain extent they did. That was true. So I can understand their antagonism towards us, in particular towards the BBC, because Loyalist and Unionist regarded the BBC, quite rightly, as the British Broadcasting Corporation, and Northern Ireland, they regarded themselves as being British. So we were seen in those early days and in some cases attacked, both physically and verbally, for being representatives of the British Broadcasting Corporation, who were betraying their responsibilities as the British Broadcasting Corporation, not understanding what the role of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Organization, really was. So they finally came over that hoop. But it was fairly hairy in those early days, covering riots, for example, when Loyalists didn't like the British Broadcasting Corporation. And
absolutely, you'd have to be thinking on your feet a lot, I'd say. Aware of the situation.
Yeah, around you. But the message was that Loyalists, the penny finally dropped for Loyalists and Unionists later in the day, that the media was there to be taken advantage of and used by their various groupings should they wish to do it. But on the proviso that they understood that I and my colleagues had a job to do, so that you shouldn't be surprised when they were given a hard time in the interviews. And I remember in one of the interviews with a Loyalist killer, it became rather edgy when I pushed him on his reason for killing a Catholic. And he was getting slightly agitated. And I thought this particular person was going to get up and walk out. And I was concerned about who might be waiting for me and my crew when we left the pub in which we were doing the interviews. But he didn't, because they knew what we were doing, why we were doing it. They knew they were going to face some tough and hostile questioning, and quite rightly, from me in the course of the interview.
Well, to be honest, maybe there's a chance if you look at the likes of Gusty Spence and how he kind of began almost this half revolution in prison to a lot of Loyalist prisoners. A lot of them never really confronted, why do you do what you do? Why am I here? Why am I in this cell?
Gusty did. That was Gusty. I got to know Gusty quite well. Gusty was responsible for, I think, the second murders of the
second ever murder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you at that interview where when he was broken out of prison, he called a press? Remember when he was? Did you break out of prison or were you kidnapped? And he had to very kind of convey that.
No, I'm not. I couldn't be at every seminal press conference, basically. In fact, I didn't live in North. I mean, I sort of commuted back to North. That's the other thing I've always said, that I hope I was never regarded as a sort of carpetbagger who came over after, in the wake of the latest atrocity, did a piece and disappeared again. That I maintained the contact with the issue. I maintained contact with key people on both sides, a good number of who actually became friends, and that was all part of building up the trust.
I then asked Peter if he ever found himself in any danger while reporting in Northern Ireland.
Well, it was always dangerous to be filming a riot, and you had to choose very carefully the position that you filmed it from. And because riots tended to ebb and flow, you had to have your wits about you to make sure you survived the riot unscathed. And ditto because in the early 70s, shooting incidents were really quite common, and the bullets would be flying. So you had to be careful. But the incident when I think I was most nervous was when I was investigating the recruitment and use of agents and informants, which the British realised they had to use and cultivate to find out what the IRA was doing. It was a classic counterinsurgency technique. And what happened is that the IRA had an internal security unit known as the Nutting Squad, of which the legendary, now deceased Steak Knife was the deputy head of the unit, is that suspected informers, British agents, were interrogated by the IRA, and if the IRA believed, if they admitted, no doubt under torture or some form of ill treatment, admitted their involvement with intelligence, then the sentence of death was passed. They were taken out, put in, and a bullet put through the back of the head. It's a very, very nasty process. But in some occasions, not every occasion, the admissions were taped. So there were tapes of the confessions of some suspected informers. And in one occasion, which was a rare occasion, 3 alleged informers were shot dead following interrogation by the internal security unit. I don't think Steak Knife was directly involved in those interrogations. And so what I set out to do was to get hold of the original of these interrogation tapes. And to do so, I was smuggled into South Almar in the dead of night in the back of a car under a blanket to be taken to a ruined cottage where 3 or 4 armed IRA men were waiting to play me the tape, and lying in the back of the car covered with a blanket in the dead of night in South Almar was fairly hairy, because there was always the danger, and this was after the so-called shoot to kill incidents, and the SAS was then highly active in South Almar and other parts of the province. And I remember just lying there wondering if the SAS or British intelligence knew Peter Taylor was going to be taken in the back of a car to hear these tips or whatever. And it's possible that they did. I never found out, didn't wish to find. But that was a concern. That was perhaps the most worrying.
Yeah, about as hairy as it could possibly.
You never know, because you're in the hands of the IRA, who are taking you to hear these tapes, which suits their propaganda. And I remember, and I finally got the tapes, and we used them in a program called Dead or Alive, a series I did called Age of Terror. And what I remember vividly is that the signal to begin the confession by these 3 suspected IRA informers, touts, was the tapping on a saucepan was a signal to begin. That's when they started confessing. So that was pretty hairy, and nothing I was glad to say happened. But it could have done. And maybe if they didn't know I was in the back of a car, there was a sitting target of a couple of IRA men driving a car with me in the back. Maybe they knew that I was in the back of the car and thought it not wise to kill 2 IRA men or arrest 2 IRA men driving a car because I was in the back of it. Well, what went through my head is, am I going to get out of this in one piece? And secondly, actually rather more importantly, will I get to hear the tapes? And if I do, can I get them to use on the program? So those are the 2 thoughts that were going through my mind. And the latter thought, will I get the tapes? Will I listen to them? Can I use them? Was uppermost rather than will I get out of this alive?
Yeah.
And I did both. I remember meeting these masked and armed IRA men in this ruined cottage where I've been taken to listen to the tapes. And one of them said to me, you don't know me, but I know you, and we've met before. And I said, really? Because he was masked. He said, yeah, I met you when you were in the maze. because I was in the Maze in 1989 doing Enemies Within, the Maze documentary, when I met a lot of IRA prisoners. And these, quotes, executions of the three suspected British agents was in 1993, or was it 92, which was after I'd made the Maze prison film. So it's possible, not likely, that if you said he'd met me in the Maze prison, it was probably true. And there it was, and was standing in front of me with an AK-47 and a mask. So it all seems bizarre and unreal, but it was real.
Yeah, it was
that's the way.
Well, like, you know, I'd say when you arrived in the wake of Bloody Sunday in 1972, I wonder, you know, would you have had any idea in your head this is going to be a very long period of time? This is going to be, you know, with this thing. I wonder, did you have much thoughts about that how long this would eventually go on for?
Well, on Bloody Sunday, when I made up my mind to try and understand the conflict and its roots, it never occurred to me how long the so-called and miscalled troubles were going to go on. But as I carried on covering it through the 70s and into the 80s, I wondered how long they would last. And in the end, it was clear it had to ask either with victory for one side, which seemed to be unlikely because increasingly it was clear by the 80s there was a stalemate, or there had to be a political solution. Political solutions have been tried unsuccessfully by successive governments, from Cheney Walk in 1972 through to other attempts at a political solution, all of which failed, not least because the paramilitaries, the IRA and Loyalist paramilitaries, Republicans and Loyalists, weren't involved in the process, and that was the key thing. That's what made it all possible in the end.
Getting the paramilitaries talk.
Only glad for doing that. So, answering your question, did I ever think how long it would last? Answer, no. But clearly, as the years went by, it was clear it was going to last a long time until there was finally a political solution, because there was no military solution, as successive senior army officers, intelligence officers, and police officers told me they recognized that there had to be a political solution, but there could only be a political solution once the paramilitaries on both sides had stopped killing people. And that was the challenge, to get the paramilitaries to declare ceasefires that would open the way for, as it happened, Good Friday.
Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Is something preventing you from reaching your goals or interfering with your happiness? Or do you find yourself at a crossroads in life when it comes to managing relationships or deciding on the direction you want to go with your career? Therapy is a great way to confront these things in your life and can help build the framework for a happier future. On a personal note, I was living at home during COVID after losing my job, and I was a bit rudderless, so I chose to do some online counselling sessions, and I believed it helped me realise what I wanted to prioritise in my life and what I valued most. It definitely helped me continue with this podcast as well. BetterHelp is a mental health platform that provides online mental health services directly to clients. It's entirely online and is convenient and flexible to fit within your schedule. They can assess your needs and match you with a licensed therapist anywhere in the world. To begin, you can fill out a short questionnaire, and BetterHelp will match you with a counsellor that best suits your needs. You can also switch counsellors at any time for no additional cost. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting our sponsor at betterhelp.com/troubles. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/troubles. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Just a quick note to say that if you are enjoying the podcast and want to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. I've been filling up this feed for a number of years now and have a huge amount of Patreon exclusive content for you to check out. Each episode gets its own companion video where I talk about what's happening in Northern Ireland right now, as well as some additional details that come up after the release of episodes. And just recently, I released a Patreon exclusive video where I talk about the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy Bill, which recently has become law and has upset thousands of people and been condemned around the world. I also have some Patreon exclusive episodes. There's one about the songs that came out of the Troubles, and I've also released an interview with Kevin Owens, who was in the Irish Army patrolling the Irish border in the 90s and has some very interesting stories to tell. So if you've been enjoying this podcast over the last few seasons and would like to help me turning this into a full-time job, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Thank you. We then began talking about Peter's new book, Operation Chiffon, but I'd like to explain a bit of context first before we get into it. From the very outset of the Troubles, the British government had been engaging in secret talks with the IRA. It was vital that these meetings take place in secret, especially as the IRA were still active and carrying out attacks, so the British government talking to them would have been extremely unpopular with the public at the time. But how did the two get in contact with each other? That's where Michael Oatley and Brendan Duddy come in. Michael Oatley, who was known to the IRA as Mountain Climber, was an MI6 agent who wanted to develop dialogue with the leadership of the Provisional IRA, with a view to influencing it in the direction of political action. But making contact was incredibly difficult, and it was Brendan Duddy who helped bridge that gap. Brendan Duddy was a businessman from Derry who had connections to the Republican leadership. He was a Catholic Republican and also a staunch pacifist who firmly believed in dialogue. It was he who convinced the original IRA and Provisional IRA to remove their weapons from the bogside in Derry on Bloody Sunday. He is the man who helped set up meetings between Michael Oatley and the Provisional IRA, and this relationship with Oatley and MI6 would span the entire length of the Troubles. When Oatley stepped down, he was replaced by a man known as Robert, whose full name has yet to be released publicly. Duddy was known as the secret peacemaker, and it was years before anyone was aware of the pivotal role that he had in brokering peace. The first secret meeting took place in 1972, and this relationship continued on and off throughout the Troubles. At the end of the first hunger strike in 1980, the connection was severed for a number of years. Peter identified a number of these individuals throughout the course of his work, but he wouldn't reveal their identities publicly without their permission, so some secrets and identities he has kept for decades. I might need to expand on this in later episodes, but let's get back to my chat with Peter. I asked him when he was first made aware of the secret back channel that was going on between the IRA and the British government.
Oh, it took a while. I mean, I was aware, and fellow journalists were aware by the late 1970s and the time of the first, in particular the first hunger strike, that there had been secret contacts between, I didn't know it at the time, between MI6, which was Michael Oatley, and the IRA, which was not the IRA of Martin McGuinness, but the IRA of Rory O'Brody and others, the old brigade, the traditional...
The old guard, yeah.
The old guard. And we were aware that there had been secret talks and some kind of arrangement, but the details were never known. It was known that at the time of the hunger strike, the so-called back channel, which I subsequently discovered was made possible by the remarkable Brendan Duddy working with Michael Oatley, because Duddy, the dairy businessman, had direct contact with the IRA and subsequently with, in particular, with Martin McGuinness and the close circle around him, became aware that these contacts, the back channel, which appeared to have died out after the hunger strike, were still in being. So I became aware that it was still operational in the 1990s, after Warrington in 1993, the dreadful Warrington bomb.
Yeah.
I became aware that the back channel had been reactivated by Brendan Duddy and Martin McGuinness, who'd made it clear publicly that the IRA were in the business of trying to work out some kind of agreement with which with which they could live. And that meant the IRA, that meant that the IRA had to talk to the British. And crucially, it meant that the British had to talk to the IRA. And that would not have happened without the back channel, because had it become known that the British government via MI6 and latterly MI5, the agent I refer to as Robert, I mean, Robert was his real name, but I've never divulged his second name, had it become known after the Warrington bomb that the British were actually talking to, if not meeting, in contact with the IRA, that the roof might have fallen in.
But yeah, it's funny, like after 60 odd episodes, you know, and just the name Brendan Duddy came up so rarely during my research, and you know, it probably did, and I didn't acknowledge it until I read your book. But like, I really, really enjoyed the imagery that, you know, sitting out in the back of a chip shop over fish and chips, you know, the most important discussions of the period were happening, and it was just these simple little conversations, small rooms, cups of tea, fish and chips, you know, debating on what sort of, how this will end, how this will go forward, what will happen here. I find Brendan Duddy a very, very interesting character. He sounds like a fairly phenomenal man who was under a lot of stress during his time.
He was. Without Brendan Duddy, I mean, I made a film about him because I actually identified who the link was, who the mystery go-between was. And I identified him as Brendan Duddy, finally with his permission. Because when I found out who he was, and to see him, I remember ringing him, saying, Peter Taylor, BBC here. And I remember him saying on the end of a telephone, to my astonishment, Peter said, I've been waiting to hear from you. And then I spent a long night's journey into day, is how I describe it, drinking Irish whiskey with, I don't drink whiskey normally, with Brendan. He told me his amazing story. And I remember saying to him afterwards, you know, I'd love to talk to you about this and your experiences when the time is right. And I will not breathe a word of your identity until you agree I can. And I think I kept that secret for 9 years, an awful long time, for many years. And finally, when he was ready to talk, I remember getting in touch with him saying, remember I said, I would love to interview you when the time was right. Is the time right now? For various reasons, the time was right. And he said, yes. So that's when I revealed his identity and his name.
What year was that? Sorry, Peter?
It would be around 2000 and early 2000s, 2004, 5, around that time.
Okay. And I think I guess your motivation by this was that, like, there was a vast majority of people who, you know, sowed the seeds for peace, and yet this was one name that just hadn't really been known about, I guess.
No, yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other person with whom Brendan was working at that time, although I didn't know who he was the person I referred to in Operation Chiffon as Robert. Robert was running Operation Chiffon, the purpose of which was twofold: to get the IRA to declare a ceasefire, and secondly, to get the IRA or the Republican movement, the IRA and Sinn Féin, to become involved in political talks. So that was the two key peacemakers were Brendan Duddy, also Michael Oakley through the 70s and through much of the 80s, and Robert, who took on where Michael Oakley left off, with Operation Chiffon leading through, in the end, to the Good Friday Agreement.
But not all of these individuals were easy to track down, and in the case of Robert, Peter began with one single Latin phrase, which would eventually lead him to finding Robert. But Robert wasn't ready to reveal his true identity to Peter just yet.
I had to find out who Robert was. When I was talking to Brendan Duddy, who worked with Robert after he worked with Michael Oakley through the 70s and the 80s. I asked him about Robert. He told me his name, but gave him no more details. He said he didn't know any more details about Robert. But he said, I have a copy of a book he gave me as a farewell gift that he signed for me. And I said, can I have a look at it? He said, yeah. So he brought it out. And the book was a book by Robert Key on Charles Stuart Parnell. And at the beginning of the book, he'd signed it to Brendan Duddy with best wishes or whatever, but also with a Latin quote from Virgil's Aeneid that said, one day it would be good to remember these things, and the quote was in Latin. And I read classics at university, so I knew the quote. And the quote was significant. One day it would be good to remember these things. So I thought that Robert, was probably a classicist, and that was the road that we went down. That, in fact, he wasn't a classicist; he was a historian at Oxford, and that was the road that took me down to finally finding Robert, finding an address for him, which was done through the auspices of a brilliant young woman researcher I had. So I went to see him, and it was in the pouring rain, and he denied. This will be in 2000, 4 years, and 2 years after the Good Friday Agreement. He had a small holding, a small farm, and it was pouring with rain. It was a sort of biblical rainstorm, thunderstorm. And there was a figure standing in the courtyard of his little farm. And I went up to him and said, excuse me, my name's Peter Taylor from the BBC. I understand that you are Robert X. I gave his second name. And he looked me straight in the eye and said, you got the wrong man. I'm afraid you're wasting your time. I'm not Robert, whatever. And I said, yeah, but didn't you know Brendan Duddy in Derry? And he said, Brendan who? And I said, didn't you work in Derry, London Derry? No, never. So I left crestfallen, like a drowned rat. And I remember, although his recollection is slightly different, I'd visited him before when he was on holiday. On a cruise on the group. Yeah, and I left the book out with a neighbour who had a cottage on his farm, and she promised she'd give it to Robert when he came back again. And I said, just before I was leaving, oh, by the way, did you get the book? And he said, oh yes, yeah. I left it with a message. He said, yes, you did. Come with me now, still in the pouring rain, and I'll give it back to you. So he takes me to the house. And my recollection is that he left me standing in the rain like a drowned rat on his doorstep. Robert disputes that. He says he asked me in, but I have no recollection of him is asking me in. And he gave me the book. So when I'm on the way back, long journey, a long way from London, I'm thinking, and I'm really crestfallen thinking, and then suddenly a light bulb moment. Hang on a second. If he wasn't Robert, he wasn't the person I was convinced, and he had all the appearances of a gentleman. I mean, he was Robert was and is a gent. He would have asked me for a cup of tea. He was, coming. So what's all this about? We've come a long way, and it's pouring rain. I'm sorry I can't help you, but come inside, have a cup of tea, dry off a bit, and tell me what happened. It never happened. It never happened. And it occurred to me that was the giveaway.
So I'm closing the door in your face. The giveaway was it.
Then 10 years later, 2 years ago now, out of the blue, I get this amazing letter. I'm back from a short break seeing my brother with my partner in Devon. And I'm opening the mail when I get back, and I get this letter. I don't recognise the handwriting on the letter. Don't get many personal letters nowadays given emails. And I open it up, and I'm shouting out loud in the kitchen to my partner, who was at the sink. I don't believe it. And she said, what is it? I said, this letter is from Robert. And she knew who Robert was because I told her what I was doing. And he says, worse than, in fact, you may remember me, but I've had a long think about things, and there are certain things which have been said about me which are not true. I'd like to put them right. If you'd like to talk to me, I can perhaps put you on the right line. So that's how I got to know Robert. I went to see him, and he was welcoming, and he was not the person, well, he was the person I met in the Flying Yarn, but in terms of attitude and character and personality and aspect, he was entirely different. He was welcoming, pleased to see me, and that was the beginning of a long relationship. And I interviewed him on many times, and with his permission, recorded the interviews. And then I said, well, you've told me all this, which is utterly fascinating, jaw-dropping stuff about meeting McGuinness, because it was reported that he told McGuinness that the Brits were basically getting out, that the long-term solution from the British point of view, Robert said, and it wasn't true, was getting out of Northern Ireland. Of course, that was music to McGuinness's ears that confirmed they were on the right course and everything else. So that was the role that he played in helping put Good Friday together by getting McGuinness and the IRA on board, which they were going in that direction anyway. And I think Robert just gave them that extra push.
But at great cost to his own career, I guess, in a way, was Robert.
Yeah, it was. Yes, he was. He did the honourable thing and resigned when because MI5 didn't know what he was doing. He hasn't. Well, it was kept so tight, so secret.
Yeah.
And when MI5 found out what he'd been doing against all orders, without any authority whatsoever, meeting McGuinness face to face, not just that, but telling McGuinness that Ireland will be as one. There was, huge consternation within MI5, understandably. And Robert then did, I said he was a gentleman. He did the honourable thing. He fell on his sword and resigned and left MI5. But his contribution was really important in terms of getting us to Good Friday. So I remember saying to him, after I'd done these long taped interviews, I think on my iPad and an iPhone, it was sort of basic technology, and I'm not great at technology. And I was just hugely relieved when I listened to them, the tapes. The tapes were there; they were intact. I said, "Well, what are we going to do with all this?" Because you can't do an interview, obviously. I could do a long thought piece for one of the broadsheet newspapers, or I could possibly write a book. There's the material there for a book, given all what I already know about Michael Oakley and what he did. How would you feel about that? And he said, that's a possibility. So that, again, to cut another long story short, that's when in the end that's what I did, and that was Operation Chiffon, the secret story of MI6 and the road to peace in Ireland.
Well, which in a way, I guess, is the culmination of people who didn't talk for a long time and then were ready to talk. If you kind of, specifically with Robert, I guess, but also if you look at Brendan as well, using, even though that you'd already covered that, I guess, in other forms of media, but this was kind of pulling it together. And I think you captured it quite well throughout the book. It's a wonderful narrative strand. It really starts at the beginning and then culminates all the way up to 2022, I think, which I think is...
It's the arc from the violence of the 70s through to the relative peace of Good Friday, and how the process of how we got there, whilst reminding people, which I do throughout the book, which I felt was really important, of the reason why peace was so vital was because the situation was just getting worse and worse and worse, and blood was flowing more freely than ever, and there had to be an end. And it's how we got there with the systems of the intelligence services and the Irish government and everybody else. So, Robert Michael Oatley were key pieces in the jigsaw that went together to peace.
I find when I write these episodes and I'm like surmising up at the end, this person's contribution, without this one person, this would not have happened. But there are so many of that one person. When you look at John Hume, you look at David Irvin, you look at anybody else, they were all such important cogs in the mechanism that would have...
I was at pain. Yeah, I was at great pains in the book to make that clear, that there were many streams that flowed into the Friday Agreement, and Robert and Michael Oatley's stream was simply one of them. It was a very important one, but there were many others. You said, John Major, Albert Reynolds, David Trimble. The list is almost endless.
Yes, it's exhaustive.
The remarkable achievement of Friday was getting all those pieces in the jigsaw together to form the picture that became the remarkable Good Friday Agreement.
As our conversation winded down, I asked Peter what he believed Sinn Féin will do now that they have grown in power in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland.
Well, they will push for the border poll. At the moment, they are the largest party on the island of Ireland, the largest party at Stormont, and there's a possibility, I think probably a strong possibility, that at the next Irish general election on your side of the border, Sinn Féin may end up as part of a coalition. So the Sinn Féin trajectory is up and up and up. The problem at the moment, the current problem, is the DUP and resolving the Northern Irish Protocol, which is the direct result of Brexit. Brexit threw all the cards up.
And the political stalemate that's kind of ensued, in a way.
Yeah. So the next move has to be getting the Stormont government up and running again, and that means getting the DUP and the Unionists back into Stormont. That means that the DUP, or the DUP without Ian Paisley, who played a remarkable role in bringing the peace together, has to share power with Michelle O'Neill, with Sinn Féin. So we're back again to, supping with the devil, if you like, in inverted commas. How that happens, I don't know. But, great efforts are being made. It's taking an awful long time. We have a British general election due possibly in the next year. All these are important factors which are going to affect what happens in Northern Ireland as well. So the first thing that has to be resolved is getting Stormont as an effective functioning government up and running again. And that really is up to the DUP. The DUP would say, Jeffrey Donaldson would say, but that's up to the British government. So it's sort of back to the ping pong again. Yeah, it's hot potato. But I think it will be resolved. But it has to be resolved. Where we go from there, Sinn Féin is going to push for the border poll. But the border poll is not in the gift of Sinn Féin. It's in the gift of the British government. That's the key thing. And the Northern Ireland Secretary has to be convinced that if there would be a border poll, there would be a considerable majority, unspecified, in favour of it. So the ball is still in the Brits' court. It's still in the court of the British government.
And as for what the future holds for Peter?
I'm what I refer to myself as being semi-retired. I'm still working, but not at the pace at which I worked for many years, because I'm now 80. So it's beginning to take its toll a little. I don't quite have the energies I had as a young reporter of the 1970s, charging around Belfast and Derry. But I'd still do it, and it would enjoy doing if and when necessary.
Yeah, so it just sees what the future holds, I guess. Well, Peter Taylor, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on this podcast. So thank you so much for giving me your time and your outlook.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and good luck with your podcast.
I want to thank Peter for taking the time to talk with me. And if you want to read more in detail about this back channel, his book is called Operation Chiffon: The Secret Story of MI5 and MI6 and the Road to Peace in Ireland. And you can get it on all major book retailers. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.